Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are talking about a nahi, which is the prohibition. A nahi or a prohibition does not have to mean that the item which is prohibited is haram. Rather, it could mean other things. And so from them would be al-karaha, or something which is hated, or perhaps you could say disliked. So an example would be the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يمسن أحدكم ذكره بيمينه وهو يبول. One of you must not touch his private parts, meaning his genitalia, with his right hand whilst he is urinating. Whilst you're always going to experience differences of opinion on issues like these, most scholars say that this prohibition or this nahi denotes karaha, or a dislike. So it is disliked or hated for you to touch your private parts with the right hand when you are urinating. And the reasoning they give behind this is that the right hand side is to be honored, as we know, and for you to touch the private part with the right hand side would be a type of dishonoring. Likewise, it would be exposing the right hand to being sullied by the urine, and that of course is not fitting. A difference also which branches out from this hadith is, are you allowed to touch the private part when you are not urinating? Some scholars would say yes, you are, because this prohibition only applies to when you're urinating. Other scholars would say no, you're not allowed to, with an even stronger reason, because when you're urinating maybe you would have a need to touch the private part with the right hand, but when you're not urinating you don't have any particular need. But if we ask, why do we say it is makruh and not haram, seeing as though the clear prohibition or nahi is given? The answer most scholars give is that your private part is a part of your body, and it is not haram to touch any part of your body, just like it's not haram, for example, to touch your head or to touch your arms. Likewise with the private parts, it's not haram to touch it, but the only reason why the nahi has been given is because of an honoring for the right hand side. So this is why we would reduce the ruling from haram to makruh. And besides, this prohibition is more pertaining to etiquettes rather than acts of worship, and many a time when it comes to etiquettes and a prohibition or order is given, then it does often denote either something being makruh or mustahab. Of course, it needs to be noted that other scholars who would simply look at what is apparent from the wording of the hadith would simply say, no, it is haram because it has been prohibited. Simple as that. However, for all practical purposes, we simply say this: the Prophet forbade it, therefore we will not do it. Be it haram, be it makruh, it doesn't make a difference practically. We will simply refrain from doing it. And that is always the best policy. So that was the first point, that a nahi can denote karaha. The second point to note is that a nahi can also denote irshad, which is simply guiding you to that which is right and proper. So to illustrate this with an example, the Prophet ﷺ telling Mu'adh bin Jabal, verily I love you for the sake of Allah, and he went on to tell him, لا تدعن أن تقول دبر كل صلاة اللهم أعني على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. Do not leave off saying at the end of every salah, O Allah, help me to remember you, to thank you, and to worship you in a goodly manner. And just as a side note, with this dua, it's important to realize where we are falling short. We would often perform the acts of worship, which is the ibadah, but do we feel that we need to ask Allah Jalla wa Ala for help in us to perform this act of worship? If we are honest with ourselves, we would have to say we do not have this feeling that we are seeking help in Allah Jalla wa Ala to enable us and to grant us tawfiq to perform a successful, accepted act of worship. So, for example, if you make wudu, do you have in your mind that you are seeking help in Allah in performing this wudu? Or when you perform the salah, do you feel that you are seeking out for help from Allah Jalla wa Ala in performing this salah? If we are honest with ourselves, then most of us would have to say no, we don't have this feeling or this yearning towards Allah Jalla wa Ala that we are seeking His help to enable us to perform this act of worship, but rather we are just performing the acts of worship like a robot. It's all just very mechanical, there's no spirit involved. But you find that Allah links the ibadah with seeking His help and relying upon Him. So for example, He says, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You we make ibadah to, and in you we seek help. Likewise him saying فَاعْبُدْهُ وَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَيْهِ. So worship him and rely upon him. So this dua is to be said after your tashahhud, before you make the salam. So it is to be said inside the salah, not outside the salah. And it is preferred for you to end off your salah just before you make the salam with the dua رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Because this is how the Prophet would like to end his dua when he would make dua. And we also know that in the last part of the circuit, when you're making the tawaf, between the Yemeni corner and the Blackstone corner, he would make this dua, of course. So he would end off the circuit of the tawaf with this dua. So it appears that this dua should be said at the end. However, the dua which we are talking about, which the Prophet taught Mu'adh ibn Jabal, is to be said after the tashahhud, because after the tashahhud is the place for dua. So these are the two alternatives to which a nahi can apply, meaning to say it could denote karaha or it could denote irshad, depending on the surrounding circumstances. The next question we would like to ask is, to which type of people does the amr or the nahi apply? Well, we say generally it applies to the mukallaf, and the mukallaf is the baligh and aqil. Baligh means he has reached the age where he is an adult and not a child anymore, and this would be the age of puberty. Aqil simply means he has his intellect intact, so it means he's not clinically insane. However, if a child has reached the age of tamyiz, which is when he's able to understand the speech and listen to instructions and carry them out properly, of course, then he can be ordered to make the prayer, for example, and other acts of worship, not by way of obligating him, but by way of making him accustomed to these acts of worship and practicing them. So when it fully becomes obligatory upon him, then he's able to perform this act of worship with ease and competency. Likewise, obviously, you would prohibit your children from doing that which is haram. For example, drinking alcoholic drinks or smoking. However, if the child does fall into committing one of these sinful actions, then this action of his, meaning the sinful action, is not of the same type as if an adult was to commit this action, in that the child is not taken into account, whereas the adult is. However, when it comes to a child or a mad person, they must be prevented from doing something which would harm other people, because even a child or a mad person would be a guarantor for any damages done to another person. Just in the same way, for example, if you have an animal, let's say a pet, some sort of hunting dog, let's say, or any animal, and it damages somebody else's property or somebody else's person, then certainly you cannot say, oh well, it's an animal, it doesn't have an intellect, therefore there's nothing upon me to do. No, rather, you would have to pay for the damages, because now the rights of another person are involved. And these rights are not based on forgiveness, rather they are based on recompense and retaliation and retribution. Okay, so if a mad person went out with his relative member, let's say, and he saw people praying, and he simply decided to follow them, is his prayer correct or not? Let us suppose he even made wudu, as other people are making it. Well, we say no, this act of worship is incorrect. Why is this? The reason for this is that this mad or insane person does not have an intention, and for every act of worship you need to have an intention. So we say the prayer is not correct for him, and neither is he rewarded. However, does this mean that the child or the insane person do not have to pay the zakah? The answer is no, they do have to pay the zakah and all other financial obligations, such as spending on your family members if they are poor. But why is this the case though? Well, with the zakah, it becomes obligatory on the wealth, not on the person. This is the crucial difference between the zakah and other acts of worship. With the Hajj and the Salah and the Siyam, it becomes obligatory on the person, but the zakah becomes obligatory not on the person, but on the wealth. And you cannot say that the wealth is mad or the wealth has not reached puberty. That's, of course, a crazy statement in and of itself. It doesn't make sense. So what the zakah is looking at is, has the wealth reached the nisab for 1 lunar year? The zakah does not care about who the owner is, whether it's a male or a female, whether it's insane or sane, whether it's an adult or a child. It doesn't care. All the zakah cares about is, has the wealth reached the nisab for 1 lunar year? If it has, then that's where the argument ends and you have to pay the zakah. And Allah Jalla wa Ala says, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. Take from their wealth a sadaqah from which you would purify them and their wealth. Of course, the insane person and the child don't need to be purified from any sins because they are sinless, but nevertheless, the wealth certainly needs to be purified. And further evidence, the Prophet ﷺ telling Mu'adh bin Jabal when he sent him to Al-Yaman, اعلمهم أن الله افترض عليهم صدقة في أموالهم. Inform them that Allah has made wajib upon them a sadaqah, meaning the zakah, from their wealth. So it is the wealth which is important here, not the person who owns the wealth. So notice this crucial difference. Now notice that we said that the amr, the order, or the nahi, the prohibition, apply to the mukallaf, the one who is baligh and aqil. But that includes a kafir, does it not? Well, the answer is yes, it includes a kafir as well. The orders and prohibitions in the sharia apply or are directed to the kafir. So for example, the order to pray or to fast or to perform the Hajj, they all apply to a kafir as well. But we do not ask them to perform it until they first embrace Islam by uttering the shahada with their tongues and with their heart. Not just that, but if they convert to Islam, then we would not ask them to perform all those acts of worship which they did not perform during their time in kufr. As for the evidence of the first ruling, that they are required to perform the obligatory duties, it is given in the Quran. Allah says, when the people of Jahannam will be asked, مَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي سَقَرٍ قَالُوا لَمْ نَكُ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ وَلَمْ نَكُ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ وَكُنَّا نَخُوضُ مَعَ الْخَائِضِينَ وَكُنَّا نُكَذِّبُ بِيَوْمِ الدِّينِ حَتَّى أَتَانَا الْيَقِينَ. What has entered you into the fire? They will say, we were not of those who established the prayer, and we did not use to feed the poor, and we would engage in idle chatter and activities, and we would not believe in the hereafter and the accounting until the certainty, meaning the death, came to us. So the point is, they did not used to pray, and this had an effect on them entering Jahannam. Because if the prayer, or the absence of it, did not have an effect on them in entering Jahannam, then what would be the use of this ayah? It would simply have no meaning. The evidence why we do not ask them to perform the acts of worship which they missed out during the time in kufr is the ayah in the Quran, قُلْ لِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِن يَنْتَهُوا يُغْفَرْ لَهُم مَا قَدْ سَلَفَ. Say to those who disbelieve, if they cease their kufr, then everything which has preceded will be forgiven. So all the acts of worship which they did not perform, and all the sins which they committed as well in the time of kufr, all of this will be wiped away, and they have a clean bill of health, so as to speak. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ telling Amr ibn al-As, when he wanted to convert to Islam, but he wanted his sins to be forgiven, the Prophet told him, did you not know, O Amr, that Islam wipes away everything that was before it? However, if all what we have said is true, this leaves us with a question. What would be the benefit or the point in us saying that all of these obligatory actions, the orders and the prohibitions, apply to kuffar, when we are not going to ask them to redo it? And it will all be forgiven anyway, yet at the same time we do not demand that the kuffar perform these actions until they first embrace Islam. And neither would we prohibit them, for example, from drinking intoxicants, because that's permissible in their deen. So in the Islamic state, we are not allowed to prohibit them from drinking intoxicants or eating pork in their own homes, despite the fact that we believe that they are prohibited from doing so because they have to obey the Sharia. So what is the practical point or the practical benefit here then? Well, the answer is, in this life there is no practical point, but the difference becomes known in the hereafter. This is the issue, because we say that in the hereafter it makes a difference, as they will be punished even more so. So for example, you have a kafir who does not drink intoxicants, and you have a kafir who drinks intoxicants. If that is the only difference between them, then we say that the kafir who drinks intoxicants will be punished more severely in Jahannam than the one who doesn't. So we find that the real difference, or the real point in this issue, becomes manifest only in the hereafter, not in this life. Okay, what if a kafir does actually perform an act of worship? What do we say about this? For example, he prays or gives zakah or does whatever good action that he performs. We say it is invalid. The evidence for this, Allah Jalla wa Ala telling us, وَمَا مَنَعَهُمْ أَن تُقْبَلَ مِنْهُمْ نَفَقَاتُهُمْ إِلَّا أَنَّهُمْ كَفَرُوا بِاللَّهِ وَبِرَسُولِهِ. And nothing prevented their charity from being accepted except that they disbelieved in Allah and His Messenger. So if the charity is not accepted, and the charity is something which benefits another person, then any act of worship which only benefits yourself, for example the Hajj or the Siyam or the Salah, is even more worthy not to be accepted. Actually, we can say that it's not just that their punishment will be increased because of their lack of acts of worship which they performed. Even the enjoyments of this life they will be punished for, such as the eating and the drinking and the shelter they enjoy and the clothing they wear. All of this is of course from the ni'mah of Allah, but they never once thanked Allah Jalla wa Ala for it. Hence they will be punished even for the ni'mah which they enjoy. Okay, let us suppose that a child performs an act of worship. Will he be rewarded for such an act? Well, the answer is yes, he will be rewarded, but not as a faridah, but rather as a nafilah. Because the faridah only becomes in effect after you become an adult. If a mad person, unintentionally obviously, kills another person, then can he be retaliated against? Well, the answer is no, because he does not have an intention, hence he could not commit an intentional murder. But for an unintentional murder, we know that you have to offer the kafara, which is to free a believing servant. If he cannot do so, is to fast 2 consecutive lunar months. Well, it's not possible for him to fast, because to fast you have to have an intention, and that's not possible for an insane person. So the only thing is about the freeing of a servant. Now the kafara is when you have committed a sin. So accidental murder is a sin, because even though it is accidental, there was still some shortcoming on your part, for which you have to atone for by giving this kafara. So the kafara is for a sin. But the insane person does not have any sin to his name. What about this scenario? If a kafir performs the salah in the state of kufr because he does not want to be punished in the hereafter. Well, first of all, we know that the salah is not correct. But the answer is that perhaps the kafir believes that this salah is beneficial, so he prays it. Now, would we say that even though the salah is not accepted from him, would he be punished for not praying? Because the point is that he has prayed. And just a while ago we said that the kafir will be punished on top of the standard punishment for not praying. So here's the question, will he receive this extra punishment or not? You might argue because the prayer is not accepted from him, therefore he will receive the punishment because he has not prayed a valid prayer. Or you might argue the other way, that he will receive his punishment as a kafir, but not his punishment for leaving off the prayer, because he did not leave off the prayer. So in a case like this, you could argue either way, but Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best. What about if a child starts the Hajj, but he no longer wants to continue? We know that once you start the Hajj, you absolutely must continue, and even if you intend to break your Hajj, the Hajj does not break. Because once it begins, it is so powerfully in force or in effect, unlike the Siyam or the Salah. Well, what about for the child though? Would we obligate him to continue on with the Hajj? Most scholars say yes, he is to be obligated to continue on with the Hajj, because once you enter it, you must finish it. True, he will not be sinful if he just breaks off the Hajj, unlike the adult, but nevertheless, we do force him to continue on with the Hajj because it is important to complete it. The other opinion held by Imam Abu Hanifa and a few other scholars is that if he does not want to continue on, then he does not have to. So for example, the child could become very tired and he is unable to continue on, so he can exit the ihram, simply on the basis that he is not mukallaf. So we say that the amr and the nahi are directed to the mukallaf, who is baligh and aqil. However, there are some mawani' or preventative factors to the mukallaf, such that the amr and the nahi will not be directed to the mukallaf. And in order to understand every matter correctly, we need to know about its conditions, but also the mawani' or the preventative factors. So for example, if we take the inheritance case, a son would inherit from his father on the condition that the father dies before the son, and we are sure of this. So if we know that the father has died before the son, then the son inherits from the father on account of the fact that he is the son. However, this does have a preventative factor, and the preventative factor would be that if the father is a kafir, then we know the son will not inherit, even if all other conditions are met. And the mawani' or the preventative factors which we shall speak about are nisyan, forgetfulness, al-jahl, ignorance, and al-ikrah, which is when you are forced to do something you do not want to. And the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَجَاوَزَ عَنْ أُمَّتِي الْخَطَأ وَالنِّسْيَانِ وَمَا اسْتُكْرِهُ عَلَيْهِ, that Allah has overlooked for my ummah the honest mistakes which they make, meaning out of ignorance, forgetfulness, and that which they are forced to do. This hadith, its authenticity could be debated, but it does have supporting evidence from the Quran. So Allah Jalla wa Ala says, رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَسِينَا أَوْ أَخْطَأْنَا. Our Lord, do not take us to account if we forget or make a genuine mistake, meaning you do something wrong without intending it. Similarly, he says, لَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ فِي مَا أَخْطَأْتُمْ بِهِ وَلَكِنْ مَا تَعَمَّدَتْ قُلُوبُكُمْ. There is no sin upon you in that which you do as a genuine or honest mistake, but rather you are sinful for what your hearts intend to do. So that covers the jahl and the nisyan. What about the ikrah, the forcefulness? He says, مَنْ كَفَرَ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ إِيمَانِهِ إِلَّا مَنْ أُكْرِهَ وَقَلْبُهُ مُطْمَئِنٌ بِالْإِيمَانِ وَلَكِنْ مَنْ شَرَحَ بِالْكُفْرِ صَدْرًا فَعَلَيْهِمْ غَضَبٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ. Whoever disbelieves in Allah, then they are the sinful ones, except the one who is forced to disbelieve, but his heart is content with Iman, but rather the sin is upon the one who openly, with his heart open, accepts the kufr. So upon them there is the anger of Allah, and they shall have a great punishment. So if you are forced to commit kufr and this is not a sin upon you, then anything else you're forced to do is even more so not a sin, because you cannot have a greater sin than kufr. So for example, when Muawiyah ibn al-Hakam spoke intentionally in the prayer because he was ignorant, the Prophet did not tell him to repeat the prayer, because he did something which was haram, but it was a khata, it was a genuine mistake because he was ignorant. Or about the one who eats or drinks out of forgetfulness, the Prophet says, let him continue on with the fasting, because he did not do this intentionally. Rather, it was nisyan, he forgot. We could also possibly use the hadith where the Prophet said, لا طلاق في إغلاق. There is no talaq when somebody has been shut off or closed off. So in other words, he is not in full control of himself. Now this could be if he's forced to divorce his wife, or it could be if he's so angry that he cannot control himself, or perhaps he is drunk. So in all of these three scenarios, he's not in full control of himself. So if he pronounces divorce in these states, then the divorce does not count. As for ignorance, then this is when you don't know what the ruling is. If somebody leaves off something which is wajib for him out of ignorance, so for example, if somebody leaves off a shart of the prayer or a rukn of the prayer because he's simply ignorant of this ruling, then we would not ask him to repeat the prayer if the time of the prayer has finished. And we know in the famous hadith of the Musi, the one who prayed badly, the Prophet told him to repeat the prayer many times, and when he said that he does not know any better, the Prophet taught him how to pray properly, but the Prophet did not tell him or order him to repeat all those prayers he prayed improperly. And his mistake was that he did not have any tum'anina in his prayer, which is one of the arkan of the prayer. What about if a muhrim has intercourse with his wife at Muzdalifah after he stood at Arafah, and he was under the belief that the Hajj is the Arafah? So when he's performed the standing at Arafah, then the Hajj is essentially completed, so he can have intercourse with the wife. Now of course that's wrong. Your Hajj is not completed. It's just that the main and essential pillar of the Hajj is the Arafah, because that's where the time limit is. Otherwise, at Muzdalifah, your Hajj is not completed, you are not allowed to have intercourse with your wife at all. But do we say that his Hajj is invalid? The answer is no, there is nothing upon him to do. He does not need to offer any kafara or anything else, because this was a sin he committed out of ignorance, and so therefore there's nothing upon him. Now this is different to leaving off a wajib action, of course. Even out of ignorance, you would have to offer the fidya, but there would be no sin upon you, that's the thing. So notice the difference between doing a haram action and leaving off a wajib action. In a Hajj, you leave off a wajib action, even out of ignorance, you still can pay the fidya to make up for that left off wajib action, and there's no sin upon you. Whereas if you perform something which is haram, you don't have to offer any fidya, and there's no sin upon you, because here you have committed an action which would otherwise be haram upon you, as opposed to leaving off an action which is wajib upon you. Although with the Hajj example, we may be able to blame the person who had intercourse at Muzdalifah, because he knows that during the state of ihram you're not supposed to have intercourse, and it would have been upon him to ask and to make sure about this affair. So from one angle we might be able to say that he is guilty of tafrit, which is when you don't do something you're supposed to do. That could be a potential charge made against him. Likewise with the fasting, we know you're not allowed to have intercourse with the wife during the fast. That's of course in the daytime of Ramadan. So if somebody did this and he was unaware of the ruling, then this is a khata, and we say your fasting is still valid and carry on. It may be the case that he knows that you're not allowed to have intercourse, but he believes that the intercourse which invalidates the fast is the one in which you ejaculate, not the mere penetration. So if that was his belief, then he had intercourse with the wife without ejaculating, but just the mere penetration, then we say again your fasting is valid and you do not have to offer the kafara. The kafara which somebody has to offer for committing a sin, for example intentionally having intercourse with your wife during the daytime of Ramadan, this of course is obligatory, because the kafara removes the effects of the sin, so that you are not taken to account for it in the hereafter. But what if somebody is ignorant of the kafara? So for example, somebody has intercourse during the daytime of Ramadan with his wife, and he's ignorant of the fact that he has to offer a kafara. Is this kafara waived from him due to his ignorance? The answer is no. He absolutely must perform it. True, he's not sinful for not performing the kafara because he was ignorant, but that does not mean that the obligation in totality is waived from him. If this person says, oh, but had I known that having intercourse with the wife during the day of Ramadan would incur this kafara, I would not have committed this sin, we say to him, no. Even if you did not know, this is not a condition. Rather, it is only a condition that you know what you are performing is a sin. This is enough. As long as you knew that it was a sin, then you have to offer the kafara, even if you did not know that there is a kafara on this particular sin. And the evidence for this is the hadith in the Sahihain. A man comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, halaktu, I have been destroyed. And he said this because he had intercourse with his wife during the day of Ramadan. Now this person says, I have been destroyed, because he knows that he committed a major sin, which is to have intercourse with your wife during the day of Ramadan. So he did this on purpose and he came penitent to the Prophet ﷺ. Now what he did not know is that there is a kafara for this sin. Now just because he did not know that there is a kafara for this sin, the Prophet did not excuse him. Rather, the Prophet obligated this kafara upon him. And we can say the same thing for zina. Let us suppose somebody converts to Islam newly and he's not aware that zina is haram, and he commits zina. Would we flog him 100 lashes? The answer is no, because ignorance is one of the mani' of the taklif, or somebody being burdened with the prohibitions and the orders. However, if someone knows that zina is haram, but he's just ignorant of the fact that you are flogged 100 lashes, and he commits zina, would we flog him? The answer is yes, we would, even though he's ignorant of the fact that you get flogged. But he was not ignorant of the fact that zina is haram, and this is the only important factor to be considered here. So notice the difference between being ignorant of the ruling of a particular sin, is it sinful or not, and the punishment of that particular sin. But here's a question though. If somebody does something wrong and then he claims ignorance, would we accept his claim? Well, the answer is we would have to look at the surrounding circumstances. If it appears to us that he is genuinely ignorant, maybe he's living in a place in which knowledge is scarce and there are no people of knowledge around, then there is every chance that he is genuinely ignorant. So, for example, if we have a person who is living amongst the Muslims in a Muslim nation, and then he claims that he did not know drinking alcohol or any khamr intoxicant is haram, would we accept this claim of ignorance? The answer here is no, we would not. Because this is the type of thing which is known by everybody. With regards to speaking in the prayer, we know this breaks the prayer if you do it intentionally, but if you do it out of mistake, it does not break the prayer. And for this ruling, we do have a specific evidence of Muawiyah ibn al-Hakam, where he spoke in the prayer and he was ignorant of this, meaning the ruling that you're not allowed to speak during the prayer. And the Prophet ﷺ at the end did not ask him to repeat the prayer. So it means that his prayer was valid, on the basis that he was ignorant of the ruling. Well, somebody might object and say that perhaps the Prophet did order him to repeat the prayer, but it was not narrated to us. We say to an argument like this that it is not possible. If the Prophet did order him to repeat the prayer, then this means that this order is part of the Sharia. And if it is part of the Sharia, then Allah Jalla wa Ala has guaranteed us to preserve the Sharia. Hence it would have been narrated to us, this particular ruling, either in the Quran or in the Ahadith. And seeing as though it has not been narrated to us, we conclude that it is not part of the Sharia. Hence, you do not need to repeat the prayer if you speak whilst you did not know what the ruling is. What about if you, through ignorance, leave off a wajib action? Well, if the time for performing that wajib action is finished, for example the prayers, then you do not need to make up for it, and you are excused because you were ignorant. But it's just that from now on it is obligatory upon you to perform the wajib action now that you have the knowledge. But this would be the case that it did not even occur to him that this particular action is wajib. As for if it did occur to him that it may be wajib, and he has something of a doubt, and he has the ability to ask and find out but he doesn't do it, then we can order him to make up for the wajib action which he has missed, even if the time is over. Because in a case like this, he is guilty of tafrit, which is not doing something you're supposed to do. And we know you are supposed to find out when you are unsure. And the evidence of this is the hadith of the Musi, the one who prayed badly, and the Prophet told him repeatedly to go back and pray because you have not prayed. And he was missing out on the tum'anina. This was the rukn which he was missing out on, so he was performing all of his actions very fast. And on the third occasion, when the Prophet asked him to repeat the prayer, he said, وَالَّذِي بَعَثَكَ بِالْحَقِّ لَا أُحْسِنُ غَيْرَ هَذَا فَعَلِّمْنِي. By the one who has sent you with the truth, I cannot do any better than this, so teach me. Notice this oath which he takes, by the one who has sent you with the truth. It's as if he is saying, whatever you say to me, I will follow it, because you have been sent with the truth. He didn't just simply say, Wallahi, which would have been enough. But here, the wording which he chose do have a particular relevance to our situation, because he's saying, whatever you teach me, I will follow it, because you have been sent with the truth. Another evidence is when the Qibla for the Muslimin was changed from Jerusalem to Mecca. And so some Muslims were praying facing Baytul Maqdis, and then an announcer came and he said that the Quran has just been revealed, ordering the Prophet to face the Kaaba. And so these Muslims who were praying, in the middle of the prayer, simply turned around and faced towards Mecca, and they did not renew the prayer. And the reason for this is because they were ignorant. Somebody might raise an objection. They might say, yes, they turned around in the middle of their prayer and continued their prayer facing Mecca, but perhaps the Prophet did not know of this, because what is apparent is that the Prophet was not there physically when this took place. We say, yes, that certainly is the case. The Prophet was not there. However, the Prophet wasn't there, but Allah Jalla wa Ala was always there. And if this action of the Muslimin at that time had been wrong, then Allah would have informed the Prophet of this. But He did not. Therefore, Allah acknowledges that what they did was correct. And there are many things the munafiqeen would do, the Prophet would not know about, but Allah Jalla wa Ala would know about, and He would inform the Prophet. Because Allah would not keep quiet when a wrong action is taken on behalf of this deen. Allah says about the munafiqeen, يَسْتَخْفُونَ مِنَ النَّاسِ وَلَا يَسْتَخْفُونَ مِنَ اللَّهِ وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ إِذْ يُبَيِّتُونَ مَا لَا يَرْضَى مِنَ الْقَوْلِ. They conceal themselves from the people, but they cannot conceal themselves from Allah, and He is from them when they plot by night time what Allah is not pleased with. So we say as a general rule that any time any companion during the time of the Prophet does something and the Prophet does not object, then this action is permissible whether the Prophet knew about it or not, because if the Prophet did not know about it, but Allah Jalla wa Ala certainly did know about it. An interesting question which is often asked is that a person is living in a place in which they believe that the salah becomes wajib when a person reaches 15 years of age. So that is the age of puberty, but we know that puberty could take place before 15 years, but they don't know about this. So for example, if a woman starts to menstruate, let's say at the age of 11, this would be an age in which the salah is wajib, but they believe no, it is 15 years of age. So this means that for 4 years she is not praying, whilst in reality the prayer is wajib upon her. So they ask about this, that they missed 4 years of prayer. Does she have to make up for it? So some scholars would say yes, she has to make up for it. But this fatwa does not seem to sit very well, because there does appear to be genuine ignorance here. And the proper times of these salawat, of course, has gone. So we would be well justified in telling her that she does not need to make up for these salawat on account of her ignorance. So we say if somebody misses out a wajib action because it has not even occurred to him that this action could be wajib, and he is therefore ignorant, then we would not ask him to make up. If it has occurred to him that it could be wajib, and he does not ask any person of knowledge, then he is a mufarrit. So he's been unduly negligent, and we would order him to make up for this action because he has fallen short. Whereas in the previous example, he did not fall short. But when it comes to being ignorant, then you can be ignorant of the ruling or ignorant of the state. So let's take the camel meat as an example. Eating camel meat breaks your wudu, according to the weightier opinion. Now if somebody is ignorant of this ruling and he eats camel meat and he prays because he's ignorant that it breaks the wudu, then we would not ask him to repeat the prayer because he was ignorant of the ruling. And this is the case if the time of the prayer has finished. However, if he eats meat and he's unaware that this is camel meat, he thinks that this might be sheep meat, but he is aware of the ruling that camel meat breaks the prayer. Now he eats this meat and it's camel meat without him knowing it, and he prays afterwards. So this prayer in actuality is invalid. Then when he finds out that this was in fact camel meat which he ate, then does he need to repeat that prayer? The answer here is yes, and it makes no difference whether it is within the time or outside the time, meaning if the time is finished, because here he is knowledgeable of the ruling, so his ignorance would not save him in this case. In both scenarios he is not sinful, because the ignorance would remove the sin, but it's just that in the second scenario he is ignorant of the state, not of the ruling, therefore he would need to repeat the prayer. So take a note of this vital difference. So what about praying towards the wrong Qibla? If you are genuinely ignorant of where the Qibla is, then that's fine, your prayer is correct. But the question we have to ask, is this person facing the wrong Qibla, is he a mufarrit or not? So for example, if you're staying at a guest's house and you have to pray and you're too shy to ask where the Qibla is, and you pray towards any old direction, then are you a mufarrit in this case? The answer is yes, you are negligent. And hence if you are praying towards the wrong direction, then you have to repeat the prayer. And you cannot say, oh well, I was ignorant of the direction. Yes, you were ignorant, that's for sure. However, you were also negligent. And it is for this reason that you have to repeat the prayer. So whereas ignorance is an excuse, but ignorance along with negligence or tafreet is not an excuse. So notice the difference. Okay, so we've spoken about ignorance. Let us move on to Anisian, which is when you forget something. So you knew about something, then it exits your thoughts or your mind. So the ruling with this is the same as with jahl. If you commit an evil action or a sin, and you've forgotten that it was a sin, then it's the same as if you did not know that it was a sin. So if you had intercourse with your wife during the daytime of Ramadan, previously you knew what the ruling was, but then you forgot about it, and then you committed this action, and then afterwards you remembered, oh yes, of course, intercourse with the wife during the day of Ramadan is haram. Then what do you have to do? Well, we say there's no sin upon you, and your fasting is not broken. Exactly the same as if you were ignorant of the ruling, because forgetfulness and ignorance do have something of an overlap. Similar, of course, if you eat during your fasting forgetfully, and for that we have a particular evidence that your fasting is valid and you continue on because it was only Allah who made you eat or drink. During the Hajj, if somebody forgetfully puts on perfume or covers his head with something which is connected to the head or sticks onto the head, like a cap or something, and he forgetfully does this, then we say he does not have to offer any fidya, there is no sin upon him, and his Hajj is not affected at all. Of course, when you remember, then you have to adjust your actions accordingly. So, for example, if you remember that you must not be eating or drinking, then you have to immediately stop eating and drinking during the fast. Or in the Hajj, you have to immediately remove the perfume which you put on. And if you forgot to pray, then you have to immediately pray whenever you remember. So here's the difference between ignorance and forgetfulness. With the ignorance, if the time elapses, you don't have to make up for anything. But with forgetfulness, you initially did know the ruling, but you forgot about it. So now even when the time of the prayer has elapsed, you still have to make up for it. And the evidence for this, the famous hadith, مَنْ نَامَ عَنْ صَلَاةٍ أَوْ نَسِيَهَا فَلْيُصَلِّهَا إِذَا ذَكَرَهَا. Whoever sleeps over a prayer or forgets it, then let him pray it whenever he remembers. So of course this could be well after the timing of the prayer. Whereas we would not say the same if you were ignorant of the ruling of the prayer in the very first place. So you are ignorant that it is wajib. However, with the salah, we have to say that you would make up for it when you forget if this salah is not tied to a particular sabab or a particular reason for praying. For example, Salatul Kusuf can only be prayed when there is an eclipse. So if you forgot to pray the Salatul Kusuf during the eclipse time and you remembered afterwards, do you pray it? The answer is no, because the Salatul Kusuf is tied in to a particular sabab, and it can only be done during that particular sabab or that particular reason. And the third of the mawani' we speak about is the Alikara. Now, forcing somebody to do something is not simply ordering them to do something which they don't want to. There needs to be an element of real force here. So, if a person of, let's say, high status or some sort of ruler orders a man to divorce his wife, and the man accedes to this demand, and then he says, I was forced to divorce my wife, is this true? Was he forced? The answer is no. He was ordered to divorce his wife, but that's not the same as being forced to divorce his wife. Whereas if somebody sticks a gun to his head and says, divorce your wife, otherwise I shoot, then this would be a genuine case of ikrah, where he's being forced to do something against his will. Okay, let us take a few review questions here. Question number 1. Does a prohibition always imply that the act is haram? Explain this answer. Question 2. What are the 3 preventative factors of taklif? And question number 3. Is ignorance of a ruling always an excuse? Explain this.